Hello, let's go ahead and take a look at Chapter 14, Fraud Risk Assessment. And what we're going to focus on in this chapter is how the management of the entity will look at various operations of the entity and see how they could affect the potential for fraud, whether it be fraudulent financial reporting, we talked about quite a bit last time, the lying, right? Or the misappropriation of assets, the larceny, the stealing aspect. Now, as we look at some of these tools, we're going to see that we're looking at it to a large extent from the standpoint of the internal management of the entity and their responsibilities to assess fraud risk and respond accordingly. But we're also going to be taking a look or really supplementing our discussion with tools that would be used by external auditors. Remember, we talked about the auditor's responsibility for auditing the financial statements and determining if there is risk of material misstatement, whether caused by error or fraud. And so some of those tools that would be used by external auditors are certainly available to the internal management as they carry out their responsibilities to assess fraud risk, respond accordingly. So we're going to sort of weave back and forth a little bit through those different tools, different discussions as we go through. And I go ahead, and you might see me clicking away on my clicker to no avail because it seems to be a little intermittent in how it wants to work. So forgive me if that gets a little annoying. So we take a look and we say, well, what is fraud risk? Well, fraud risk is the risk that the entity will have fraud. And so when we look at that from the standpoint of vulnerabilities, okay, the vulnerabilities to the entity overcoming the elements that enable someone to commit fraud. And we talk about it from the standpoint of both, again, of fraudulent financial reporting, lying, misappropriation of assets, the stealing. Now, we've talked about the fraud triangle, and I know that we've used some different terms in describing that fraud triangle. We've talked about non-shareable financial need, but we've also defined that as what I guess you would call that a certain amount of pressure. Okay, but also incentive. All of those are really falling into that same first category there as we start to talk about, well, what are the potential that we're going to have some fraud from pressure. Hey, I have to show good earnings or I'm going to, be fired or something, be disciplined in the organization. Incentive, wow, if we show a better earning, I'm going to get a bonus and this may be my last chance to get the bonus or something. Non-shareable financial need, I've gotten myself a little bit out in terms of my own personal financial responsibilities, and I really am to the point now where I'm going to have to commit some sort of, probably there, we're talking about misappropriation of assets more, and have to steal some of the resources of the company to help see my own personal financial problems, right? Opportunity always comes down to, in my mind, the internal control. Okay, the internal control weaknesses will create opportunity, and we're going to do our best to close those off, to correct those, but nothing is perfect, and so there's always going to be some amount of opportunity, and we're going to see that there are some ways, and we call that residual risk, and there's some ways of dealing with even that residual risk, but no internal control system is perfect, right? It's always kind of susceptible to some sort of inherent weakness is what we call that. Ability to rationalize, okay? Look, I've been working at the company for all these years. They always promote somebody else. They always give an opportunity to somebody. I never get the opportunities. Let me steal $25 million. That will justify it, okay? They don't go that far, but the ability to rationalize that. Okay, now as we look at these fraud risk factors, we're also going to look at how various risks that could lead to the fraud are affected by the presence of those fraud risk factors. And we talked about that a little bit last time as well. We'll get more into some of that here in a couple of minutes. Now, no organization is immune to fraud risk. Okay, I think that's pretty obvious, right? Bad things happen to good people, to good companies. So no one is immune. Awareness of the weakness, knowing that you are vulnerable and then responding accordingly to weaknesses that may make you more susceptible to some sort of fraud risk is sort of the starting point, right? The truth will set you free kind of thing. Risk can be internal, our own employees, our own management, But there's also external risk, and then we may have customers trying to fraudulently use our resources, steal from us, not pay us obligations. In government programs, there's a significant amount of external risk, and various entities maybe try to take advantages of some weaknesses in government programs. And a lot of times I heard people say, oh, the government they don't know what they're doing. Well, the volume of transactions associated with government operations, or the volume of transactions associated with a non-government, with a business operation, are something that would make them vulnerable. So often the volume of potentials will make an entity vulnerable to risk. So no entity is immune, even the federal government, right? So we need to look at the nature of the business. What is our operating environment? Are we fairly stagnant operating environment? Are we dynamic? Is there a lot of technological change, a lot of expectations from our customers that we'll be on top of technology, these sort of things? What are the effectiveness of the internal controls? And I think, as you probably know that I'm a big proponent of looking at the internal controls and determining how they're affecting our fraud risk. Ethics and values of the company. Remember, we talked about, I'm going to show you here in a little while again, the committee sponsoring organization of the Treadway Commission's model for assessing the internal control of an entity. But remember, we said that all starts at the top with the control environment, not only by having policies, procedures, tone at the top, the ethical values of the company and whatnot, but making sure that the top management of the entity also displays those ethical values, etc. Now, fraud risk assessment, okay? And we're literally going to look at how various risks can affect, and both it's our fraudulent financial reporting, but also our misappropriation of assets. Okay, so I'm just going to put that down right now. Okay, so what do we have? We have inherent risk. Okay. We have control risk. I guess I should go ahead and put this in the form of a formula. And then we have detection risk. Okay, now when we look at this, we look at it in the standpoint of audit risk. And when the auditor looks at this, they look at, well, what is the risk of material misstatement? And that RMM is really constituted, as you can see, I'm drawing a little hoopty there going up, of risk of inherent risk and control risk feed into the risk of material misstatement. And then the auditor tries to control the detection risk accordingly so they can detect the misstatement in the financial statements. And typically we're thinking about what fraudulent financial, whether caused by error or fraud. And we're talking about fraudulent financial reporting there because we're talking about the risk of material misstatement. But there's no reason that we couldn't also call this what? The risk of misappropriation of assets. The stealing. Why not? We could sit there and we could assess this risk as it relates not only to fraudulent financial reporting, but also the risk of misappropriation of the stealing. And auditors will use this, but there's no reason why management can't look and say, well, here are the various risks that we're facing, inherent risk. How do we deal with the control risk? And then how would we somehow detect that? Now, when we look at the fraud risk factors, right, which is what? Incentive and pressure, what they were calling some sort of, unshareable financial risk. We have what? We have opportunity. And then we have the rationalization. I'm just going to call that rat attitude. Okay, sometimes I like to have a little fun with that, but that's the rationalization. Okay, now what happens when we look these different fraud risk factors as we identify them as they exist affect these different formulas that can lead to what? Lead to our audit risk, that can lead to what? The risk of material misstatement, the risk of appropriation of assets, misappropriation of assets. For example, and I've said this a number of times now, opportunity focuses right squarely on control risk, right? Incentive and pressure could what? Could hit onto our inherent risk. Sure, right? There's pressure. I need to meet certain earnings requirements. So let me make our accounting so complex that nobody really fully understands how this is working. And I can manipulate the numbers accordingly so I get my bonus or I don't get fired, right? Rat attitude, as I'm calling it, right, could affect the control risk, and that somebody will start to say, well, I'm going to circumvent the controls. I don't care about the ethical values of the company because I'm not being treated right anyway, right? Now, you look and we take a look at control risk from the standpoint of rationalization of attitude. And I'm talking about it from the standpoint of an employee, but maybe it's management overriding the controls because they believe that they're entitled to do so, because maybe they own the company or they're in a high position in the company, or maybe because what? Because they have some incentive and pressure that is causing them to override the controls, okay? And then what we will look at is, well, what are some procedures that, and we tend to look at it, as an external auditor all these years, I tend to look at it from the auditor's standpoint to try to look at the detection risk, but also management needs to look at, well, what are our programs, policies, procedures that are gonna allow us internally. You don't want to wait around waiting for the auditor to find these things, right? To allow us to detect these. So as we look at controls, we'll look at preventative controls, which stop the problem from happening, but also what? Detected controls. And so you can almost think as that detection risk as how does the entity itself detect these? And of course, that would be part of their controls. And the auditors, of course, would say, well, if management has good detective controls, that's more on the control risk side. So we don't have to worry as much about our detection risk as auditors. So again, as I mentioned, we're sort of weaving it out a few times as how external auditors would look at this versus the internal entity. Again, obviously, the objective is to help to prevent, detect, deter fraud in the organization by putting the appropriate measures, programs, and whatnot in place. Now, why should we do the fraud risk assessment? To be honest with you, because if you're a public company, you have to. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, there is a requirement that management assess the effectiveness of their internal controls and report on that externally in their annual filings with the SEC and their annual reports and whatnot. And so you have to. Okay. Now, some of these other things are good reasons to make sure that everyone understands that we're interested in preventing, detecting fraud, obviously, and then what are areas are we vulnerable? How do we respond to that by mitigating that risk? And then, developing some of these techniques to help us detect the risk if it has occurred, as I mentioned a minute ago. So, maybe you could have put this little slide first. You got to do it. If you are a public company, there's an expectation that you have looked at your internal control, made an assessment of risk in general, not just fraud risk, but risk of reliability, the risk that you won't have reliable financial reporting. So you need to look at it from that standpoint, but also the risk of the misappropriation of assets. And we need to do that. Now, sometimes we're required to by federal statute. Sometimes, students will look at that and they'll say, so if I'm not a public company, I don't have to do this. No, because I would think that most companies are trying to attract capital somehow. And if you're trying to attract capital, either through loans or through investors, then those potential investors, those underwriters and whatnot, they're going to want to look and they're going to want to say, well, look, what are the appropriate internal controls that are going to protect my interest, my investment in the company? And they might very well ask you to do this sort of assessment as part of their decision process in determining whether or not they want to invest with you. So it's not just limited to publicly held companies. So we need to go ahead and we need to assess the controls. Now, a little bit the way this is describing it, it sounds like we've ignored the internal controls for some time, or we never did this, and now we're finally going to be doing this. Well, look, under the federal statute, you must do this annually. And I'm going to talk about how to assess the controls here in a second. But remember, we talked about that the control environment that sits at the top. We do what? We do the risk assessments that we're going to be talking about here. We respond accordingly by having policies and procedures in place. We communicate, and then we monitor. We're going to likely have an internal audit department that's going to be doing that monitoring. But if there is no internal audit department, then that rises up to the responsibility of the audit committee to put together a team, or the board of directors to put together a team. And it's probably the audit committee or the one person that's sort of tasked with these sort of things to then monitor and see if the controls are achieving the objectives. And if they are not, that feeds back into the control environment, either because the board of directors themselves are doing this, or the internal auditors are reporting directly to the board of directors to let them know about weaknesses in the control. And we start that process over. Okay, well, what are our risks? How do we respond? How do we communicate? And then we monitor. So even though we show it in the form of a cube, and I'll put that slide up here in a couple of minutes, it's really a circle. So it's an ongoing process. So even though we're sort of laying it out here as, oh, okay, let's do this. We've never done it before. We haven't done it in a long time. It's a little bit stale. It should be an ongoing process in which the entity is, at a minimum level, I would think, doing something on a quarterly basis to be able to look. And by quarterly basis, you could do some sort of variance analysis. How are we performing against expectations? And you see some things out of tolerance, you would probably want to turn the microscope up on that to understand what's going on and what sort of adjustments need to be made. So it's ongoing process. So I probably could have put this up a minute ago, but remember the pieces to our internal control structure contemplated by the committee sponsoring organizations of the Treadway Commission, COSO. And they came up with this model some years ago in which you have the control environment, the risk assessment, control activities, communicate, and then you monitor. And then again, as I mentioned, that feeds back up. Now notice that we talk about it in terms of what? In terms of fraudulent financial reporting, but there are also compliance issues, controls to make sure that we're operating within compliance with laws and regulations. I mean, watch the news. That's happening all the time where companies are finding themselves in hot water with different, regulatory entities because they probably didn't pay enough attention to this stuff. And then operations, and really operations can get to that misappropriation of assets to a large extent as well. So it cuts across the various aspects. I think as an auditor, I'm always thinking about this, but as an auditor in the government, I also thought about this quite a bit. And then, the operating aspects are also important, and that'll cut across the various aspects of the organization, various levels of the organization. Okay, good. So how do we put together a good fraud assessment team? Okay, it's a collaborative effort. Okay, it is not just management sitting at the top of the organization, the board of directors saying, okay, you need to do this. We want to get cooperation throughout the organization. However, that doesn't mean that the board of directors says, hey, you, buddy, you just joined the company. We're going to give you a big, huge responsibility. We need you to assess our risk of vulnerability to fraud. You're going to lead this. No, it is likely sponsored and led at the senior levels of the organization with a multidisciplinary team that will be able to not only get some to sophistication as we go across this process, but also to get a larger, broader buy-in as to what we're thinking needs to be done as part of this, and that will feed in that communication. Independence and objectivity are necessary. I mean, that group needs to really, it could be, okay, that as this organization starts to do this task, that they look to the board of directors and they say to the board of directors, you need to take on more responsibility here. You're not really doing some of the things you should be doing from the control environment aspect. There is a responsibility for an external auditor that if you determine that the board of directors has not carried out the responsibility, they put it in standard to auditors. You are to communicate that. That is a required communication. Sometimes that's a tough job because the board of directors really decides who the auditors of the company are going to be. And then all of a sudden you're telling them, well, you're not doing your job. They may take personal offense and say, well, you're not doing your job. Goodbye. And so that gets pretty tough. I was on an assignment years ago where we looked and there were some problems with some of the actions of the board of directors. And when we took a closer look at that, we found that there was no code of conduct. And so one of the recommendations that we came up with was that this was a credit union that we were looking at. The National Credit Union Administration require that entities establish the credit unions under their under their supervision, that they require the credit unions to have a code of conduct, et cetera. Okay. They need to have a good working knowledge. That's probably why you're going to put together a disciplinary team so that there's a multidisciplinary team. There's access to all levels of the organization. The ability to think the unthinkable. You really need to have professional skepticism. So it doesn't mean that you walk around saying, oh, that person, more the ability to say, well, look, the door has been left open. There's opportunity, okay? And folks are probably going to walk through that door. It's human nature. It's history. Since time began, these things have been going on. And I'm here to tell you guys, if you're waiting for them to stop, they're not going to, okay? And so you need to think that way, professional skepticism. Not that you're calling out individuals and saying, well, that person. You're looking at the opportunity and then saying any person could walk through this, and this is the door that we need to close, or see if somebody has walked through it. Or if somebody does walk through it, how will we know? How do we close the door, prevent it? How do we detect it? How do we determine if it has already occurred? Okay, so you take a look at some of these things and assembling the right team. Obviously, particularly if we're talking about the financial reporting aspects, the accounting, financial personnel, but often accountants, if I may, brag about accountants a little bit, we're trained to do this. I mean, this is a large part of things that we study as to how to have controls that will prevent, detect fraudulent financial reporting, misappropriation of assets. We need individuals who have a day-to-day knowledge. Risk management personnel. Most large entities will actually have a piece of the business that is dedicated to risk management. And often those are people that have been accountants, auditors, okay, and have risen up to the level of the organization where they're focusing on risk management. General counsel or legal counsel, whether internal or external. You may want to think about potentially bringing somebody in, because trying to get an external attorney to be involved in that could get somewhat costly. So you might look for an internal attorney to be involved in this. What are some of the legal exposures? Internal auditors, again, key part of the monitoring process, and internal auditors really are part of the internal control, and that they're doing that monitoring. And there should be a structure. They need to be highly objective. So there needs to be structure where they're able to report directly to the board of directors. Sometimes you'll see a dotted line if you look at an org chart of an organization over to the CFO. That's just simply an administrative line that's allowing them to be paid, that sort of thing. But from the standpoint of their reporting line, that's typically going straight up to the board of directors. And then you could engage some sort of external consultants, obviously, as well. Now, techniques, interviews, talking to, interviewing, bring folks in, asking them about their awareness of the controls, their awareness of actual incidents of fraud, misappropriation. We're going to talk more about interviewing techniques here coming up in fairly shortly in our next chapters. And I'll talk to you a little bit about where we're going in the next week or so towards the end of class here. But those sort of techniques, we'll talk about that. Focus groups, surveys, anonymous feedback mechanisms. Again, remember, whistleblower protection is something that is protected by federal statute. And so that would be a way of allowing us to detect some frauds or techniques that would be used as part of this process. Again, we need to have the sponsors agreement on the scope of our work, the methods, the participants, form of output. You put together a group like this, and if it is known, there should probably be some sort of communication from the top of the organization saying, the team is going to be doing this work. It's important that you cooperate with the team that's doing this work, et cetera. Some sort of email memo, something like that should be communicated from the highest level of the organization. And of course, you want to make sure that they are informed about what are the methods, techniques, who are the personnel that are going to be involved, that sort of thing. And then making sure, again, that that is communicated throughout the organization, educating them accordingly. Now, we look at the potential for fraud risk, and we start with incentive and pressure. And again, we're looking to see how these broad triangle, incentive and pressure, and again, guys, gets a little annoying, incentive and pressure and unshareable financial risk. We're kind of getting that into one category. And then, of course, we look at what the opportunities, and then also not listed here necessarily, but then the rationalization. So we look and we say, well, what is the potential that there'll be opportunity? Position, higher level in the organization, there's more potential to override the controls. Again, we talked about incentives such as performance measures. The weak internal control, okay, is going to be, I can point them up here to where they belong, is the opportunity. High complex business transactions. Maybe that's happening just because, the transaction is complex. And so there's more opportunity to, make that so difficult that it makes it difficult for us to detect that. Collusion, collusion is something that is very, very difficult to deal with when you're trying to deal with fraud, because what happens, one of our key controls is going to be separation of duty. Separation of duty says that we should separate the authorization of a transaction from the record keeping to the actual custody of that asset. Well, so that I'm going to authorize a disbursement. Another person in the organization will be responsible for releasing those funds. And then the accounting department would be responsible for recording the transaction in the records. Now, often, you can have a highly automated environment in which individuals are simply clicking icons on a computer practically to have these things happen. And so one way we could, separate duties in a highly automated environment is we would look to see that individuals only have certain rights in the system. So I may have the right to authorize, Bill over here will have the ability to actually release the funds through an ACH process, whatever. And then, Susan would have the responsibility to then make sure that that whole transaction is properly recorded in the financial statements. and they would only have codes in the system. Their limitations in the system would only allow them to execute those functions. But in my example, if me and Bill get together to circumvent the controls, that's very difficult. If I turn around and I give Bill my code, well, that's a problem. Now, what would we do? We could detect that. If we were able to look into somehow to Bill's profile and get a listing, or have some sort of error report that's listed if from Bill's account or something, he somehow executed something that he wasn't supposed to, or maybe have surveillance cameras in place and whatnot. But now we start getting into the detective aspects, and I think I've talked enough on this as you're starting to get a sense as to how difficult collusion is to deal with. So there's always going to be, you will never turn the risk of financial fraudulent financial reporting, which is basically what we are defining as our audit risk, or misappropriation of assets. Those two risks, they will never be zero. There will always be some level of risk remaining. We call that residual risk. And we also could have some ways of dealing with that residual risk, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Management override of controls, again, comes from a high level in the organization. Obviously, that's affecting our control risk, but it could be coming from a rationalization. And then, of course, if you were involved in masterminding the system, then you might, have some ability to override the controls because of your detailed knowledge of the controls. Okay. Inherent risk factors, population of fraud risk, fraudulent financial reporting, misappropriation of assets. We talked about collusion, regulatory legal misconduct. Remember, we talked about compliance as part of that overall structure. Reputation risks to the company, even though the company in some cases may be the ones that are being the victims of fraud risk. We don't want, imagine if you're a bank and all of a sudden, you started getting into the financial press and whatnot that we were being robbed by our employees. Well, now depositors might be, I don't know that I want to have my funds in a bank that can't even keep track of things for themselves, right? And then risk due to information technology. Obviously, we have the issue of hackers that could be getting into our system. Information technology could affect regulatory legal misconduct. If we are holding sensitive data, medical information and whatnot, that could be a problem for us, and that we wouldn't be in compliance with regulatory requirements. So a lot of risk around information technologies, I'm sure this is a risk that we can share with others. By that meaning we can get some insurance. Well, we could probably maybe not share it, but mitigate that risk to some extent, I think, is a better one to think about there. And that you can get what they call trust assessments done, okay, trust agreements, where you have an independent party come in and look at your various activities and then see if they believe that your controls are robust enough to make sure that you're in compliance, say, with the HIPAA laws, the healthcare laws for reporting and stuff. And that gives you some level of insurance because you've had a third party look at your systems as they relate to whatever the information technology exposures may be. So you can mitigate some of the risks through that process. Okay. Assessing the likelihood of occurrence. Well, has it happened before? Okay. Does it happen a lot in this industry? What is our internal control? And they're calling the environment, but it's all of those pieces that we talk about: environment, the risk assessment that we conduct, all of those different pieces of that COSO structure. We would look at that and say, are there vulnerabilities here? Okay, what are our resources? I talked about separation of duty, and you're thinking, well, what if it's a small company and there's only one or two people within the company? Well, if that's the case, then you would have to find some way of trying to mitigate some of the lack of separation of duty through additional procedures that you might want to perform there. But obviously, we're limited by the size, the resources of the organization. Needs to be the support, needs to be the expectation, the ethical standards, codes of conduct, transaction volume. I mentioned the more transactions, the more vulnerable, the more complex the transaction, the more that there may be some shenanigans that would, result probably in fraudulent financial reporting there. Unexplained losses. We talked about trends last time. Why is it taking us so long to collect on our receivables? Well, maybe you were collecting and the funds are being pilfered or something, right? And then complaints by customers or vendors. Yeah, I don't think we want to wait till that, till we get called by the FBI to say, why are you doing all these overseas, wires? And then it turns out that, we've fallen into some sort of, phishing scheme, and that's why that's happened. So you want to try to prevent it before it's really getting to that. But that is a way of finding out, but probably not the most efficient way to find out. Okay. Now we come over and we assess and we start to look at the financial the items that will be more financially significant to not only our reports, but also, for example, cash, right, is something that's going to be more vulnerable and more significant to the company. Financial condition of the company. Again, if I'm not looking too good, I'm worried about my position, I might engage in fraudulent financial reporting. Again, the value of the threatened asset. Small items that are easy to walk out with, that are fairly fungible, are items that are particularly vulnerable. Okay. For example, not so much the case these days, but there were times where you would have certain securities that were bearer. If you had them in your hand, then you were able to negotiate those. Well, those sort of things, obviously cash is that. So you need to be careful with those sort of things. Revenue generated by the threatened assets. So if we're sitting there and we have an asset that's threatened and it's going to impair our ability to generate revenue, obviously we're concerned about that. Okay. And then is there going to be some sort of effect to our brand if there's some sort of problems? And then criminal, civil, regulatory liabilities. I saw one of the big car manufacturers now is having a problem that they use some airbags that were unsafe. And they're saying if you're driving a vehicle that was built between 2000 and 2006, you need to stop driving that vehicle immediately so we can change out the airbags. And I'm thinking to myself, what took them so long? I mean, this is, 17 years later, you finally find out that there was a problem with an airbag, and just raise the question to me, did they know about this sooner? I mean, somebody's got to take a look at that, because why would you only after 13 years later be saying, oh yeah, there might be a problem with the airbag in this 2006 or 23 years later, a 2000 car? It seems like you would have known about that a little sooner. Or is it easier to admit that you have the problem for cars that hardly no one is driving anymore, and maybe they knew sooner? I don't know. That was what ran through my head. But again, regulatory, civil, that's why that's coming to mind. Civil regulatory liabilities, I would think individuals who are maybe hurt by those defective airbags might want to know, well, when did you know about the problem, right? Okay, so we want to avoid those kind of things by having the proper internal controls. And remember, our internal controls, and we tend to think of it right there in the financial reporting zone, but it's also compliance, but also operations, that we want our company to operate, in an ethical, responsible manner, right? Okay, so coming over, evaluating which people and departments most likely would commit the fraud, identify the methods that they use, and then respond. And again, we keep talking about that fraud risk formula, the opportunity aspect and the not formula, but the factors, fraud risk factors, the fraud triangle. We mentioned opportunity as, okay, it's just the third cousin here of the three, it's one of the triplets, whatever. But the reality is that tends to be where we address all our efforts. We address our efforts around the control part, around the opportunity part, okay? And we look at that in terms of preventative controls, prevent the problem from ever happening, or if it does, how will we detect it so that then we can close that door, back up from doing this. So the internal auditors have detected something, and we're feeding that back into the board of directors so we can start to make the new risk assessment now that we know some things have happened, respond accordingly, communicate, and continue to monitor. It's an ongoing process. Now, not shown here, you could have corrective controls, and that when we think about the world these days with the artificial intelligence, maybe the system itself is doing something to close some of those holes as they occur. So if something doesn't look as though it should have processed through in a certain manner, that is immediately flagged, and maybe there's some sort of alert that says, well, we're not going to let any more transactions go through this loop until somebody, a human being, comes back in and says, okay, that's okay, that was a one-off, or we need to fix how that transaction was viewed by the system, whatever. So artificial intelligence, I think, provides a great opportunity here to close off some of those opportunities on a real-time basis. And I would think that might fall into a category of, maybe you could say, well, John, what's the difference between that and a preventive control? Well, it correct the problem after it had happened once. So I could call it another category. Okay, bear with me. I would call it corrective control. Okay. All right, good. Coming over and taking a look at determining if the controls are operating effectively and efficiently. Okay. And, I'm probably more interested in the effectiveness of this as time goes on. To me, efficiency is something that evolves over time as you start to see how the controls are working, and as the organization gets more efficient at putting those controls into operation, then maybe you can look for some efficiencies, but they first got to be effective, right? So reviewing our accounting procedures, again, management override of the controls, a major concern that we'll need to address appropriately. So we'll do interview techniques, we'll observe. So really what we do, what would be suggested is you obtain an understanding, you do the interviews, you obtain the understanding, you look at the policies, procedures, you see where the controls are. Then you would go and observe to see if those controls are being implemented. So you can have a control that is well designed. So you talk and you hear how they're doing things and you say, okay, that design is pretty good. And then you get into the actual observation. Sometimes we call that a walkthrough. We're actually walking the transaction through, and the control's not implemented because individuals are not paying attention to their responsibilities, or maybe they're not equipped with the knowledge to properly implement that control. So it doesn't do any good to have a good design of the control if it isn't implemented. It has to be designed, it has to be implemented. And then you can go and sample a set of transactions to see if indeed that control is consistently applied throughout whatever the period is that you're investigating here. Often when a team is assembled like this that is doing a walkthrough, observing the control, everybody's on their best behavior. Everybody makes sure to stamp that thing 3 times that they're supposed to, or whatever it is they're supposed to do, right? Okay, then what? Then as soon as the auditors leave, as soon as the team leaves and they're done with their study, they go back to their bad habits. So what do? You pull a sample of transactions that would have occurred throughout the year to see if there is evidence of that consistent application of that control, meaning that a good control would have some sort of, I'm going to do the annoying quotes, paper trail, because these days, almost everything's automated, but there should be some stamp, signature, computer generated acknowledgement of some sort that a control is applied consistently throughout the period. Now, you could also use techniques in which you would be able to electronically see that transactions will be consistently applied. For example, there's something called transaction tagging, where you can tag a transaction in computer-assisted audit technique. You can tag a transaction and carry out throughout the process, throughout the system to see how it works. You could do something called an integrated test facility, in which you'll put in transactions that are fictitious transactions to see how they process, and you can pull those off to see how they process. Now, sometimes companies won't want to do that because they're afraid that there's going to be a problem, that the system is going to crash. And so you could do something called a test facility where you offline on the weekend or something, you run some transactions through. The only problem is there, you won't be able to see how in a real-time type environment, how the entity's employees, how your employees interact with that information. So, the integrated test facility would probably be better. You could use parallel simulation. You could write a program that is supposed to process transactions in a way that the main system does, and see if you get the same answer on real transactions. See if you get the same answer that the main system got. These are all ways of getting around, we say perform a sample testing of controls, and they're like, well, we don't have any documents we could look at. How do we do this? You could use computer-assisted audit techniques, but you have to get some evidence, okay, sample something that will allow you to see that a control is not just working when you observed it and implemented, but it also has operating effectiveness. Was it in effect throughout the entire period? And then again, as I've said, you can become more efficient at that as you go along, right? And then there could be previous external audit reports or previous reports of fraud instances and whatnot. And they're sort of putting that here at the end. I think that would be more in your assessment of the fraud risk. So if you've identified problems before, in my opinion, in anyone's opinion, that would be driving up your inherent risk. Hey, it's already happened. Why did it happen? Oh, okay, there was incentive, there was pressure, there was opportunity. That's driving up my risk of either material misstatement or misappropriation of assets. And so now I'm going to want to see that I have something in there that will allow me to detect, prevent, correct that from happening in the future. Okay, identifying and evaluating residual fraud risk. So after you've done all this, there will always be some risk left over. Now, sometimes students struggle a little bit with this idea of risk management. So let's just use a very completely different example from fraudulent financial reporting, misappropriation of assets, whatnot. When you drive a car, what do? You are very careful. You obey the traffic laws, etc. You keep both eyes open, both hands on the wheel. You're not distracted. You do all those good driving practices, right? Okay. And what else do? You click the seatbelt. Now think about it. If you had done everything perfectly, if you had done everything perfectly when you drove, everything perfectly, you could still have an accident. That's why you put the seatbelt on. You put the seatbelt on. The seatbelt doesn't say this is going to avoid the accident. The seatbelt says I'm going to have an accident, and this is going to do what? Mitigate my risk of significant injury or death, right? Because it's going to hold me in. The airbag, although it's one of those bad airbags, then the thing's got a problem. But the airbag isn't saying, well, what prevents you? The airbag doesn't come out and grab the steering wheel from you before the accident. The airbag says there will be an accident, and we're going to do what? Mitigate some of the risk. Insurance, what does insurance say? Insurance doesn't say, well, you won't have an accident, we're going to help you. I mean, they have some things that they say, we want to help you with good driving rules and stuff, and that's to protect their interest because they don't have to pay out, right? And then it also helps you too. But bottom line, the insurance isn't because you decided you're not going to have an accident. There's no way. The insurance is saying, I will have an accident. And if I do, I'm going to share this risk with the insurance company and so on. Okay. So we need to look and say, if after you've done all of the things you're supposed to, there's still a risk that the bad thing will happen. how do you deal with what we are calling here? We're going to call it residual, the remaining risk. Okay, so avoid the risk would say, well, you know what? The thing that's causing the risk, we're not going to even do it. Let's say you're looking at your reputation risk and you're worried that you'll have an oil spill on a pristine part of the California coast or something, and you're a major oil company, you don't want that on your record. What do? You just don't drill there. You just decide not to do it. It's not worth the potential reputation risk there, so we're just not going to do it. Transfer the risk, and again, transfer is another, I've seen it in other literature called sharing the risk. Okay, transfer, share the risk is insurance. Okay, and again, the more insurance you pay, the more risk you're transferring to the insurance company, but you may have deductible, or you may insure yourself only up to a certain limit, which would, to me, fall more into the share. Mitigate the risk. Okay, the bad thing's going to happen, but how can I lessen its impact? So yeah, there's a risk that I might have, fraud where somebody's misappropriating cash. And so maybe somebody will get out with a small amount of cash, but if a transaction gets over a certain dollar level, again, that maybe get into that efficiency part of things. Now I'm going to start to put in some additional controls around the higher dollar amount transactions, or transactions related to cash have to have more controls than other transactions, etc. Or just assume the risk, which basically says do nothing. Okay, we're just gonna let the bad thing happen, ride in the car without seatbelts. No, nobody does that, but that would be the analogy there. Okay, and then a combination, I suppose, of probably what most companies do, and it really depends on the risk, on the thing that you're talking about. Okay, good. Now report the objective and the results. I don't know what they mean by subject, but in your report, you should be saying, this is the objective, to improve the controls, and then this is what we found. Okay, I don't know, keep it simple. I don't know what that means. Focus on what really matters. Okay, yeah, so maybe that's all part of keeping it simple. Don't be talking about, well, don't be wasting time, protecting pens in the office supplies. Everyone should remember, don't eat too many donuts. Okay, that's not what you're looking for there. Okay, and then have something clear and measurable. If you could quantify the risk, quantify how it could affect the company, that sort of thing. The individuals working there, will help deal with some of that rationalization, I think. Okay, what it does is begin a dialogue. Maybe helps individuals say, well, I did see that other time. Have we looked into this, etc. Look for, you should have looked in the beginning for high risk areas, and then hold individuals responsible for progress and keep the assessment alive and relevant. Again, corporate environment, public company environment, every year statute. In case, statutes, sometimes folks complain about statute and regulation and whatnot. These statute regulations come often because there's been, a problem. There's been, rot in a particular area of our society, and the regulations come in to address those. And so you had all those shenanigans and whatnot that brought in Sarbanes and said, well, look, since you can't figure it out, the importance of this, we're going to tell you, do this every year. Okay, and so and many times companies that are wanting to go public maybe, or have significant external investors if they want to protect their interests, have fallen into the pattern of doing these things even though they're not required to. At least by a regulatory standpoint, their investors would be requiring them to do that. Okay, but then we have what? We have the auditors, and the auditors are looking at these same things. Now, it's important to say something here, in that sometimes I think People think, well, this is the auditor's job. I'm the management of the company. The auditors need to come in and make all these assessments and tell me what to do. Well, it is required in the COSO, not the COSO, excuse me, the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements that the CEO, CFO, and senior management have to attest in that report that they did not rely on the auditor's procedures to do this. And so it's not just, well, hurry up, auditors, do this, and I'll do whatever you tell me to. It's got to be management proactively being involved in this. And so even though auditors do this work, as mentioned here, and as we mentioned, we looked at the auditing standards on this in previous classes, it is still the responsibility of management to do this kind of work. Okay, good. So with that, let's take a look. Okay, and I want to hopefully have some success in pulling up our practice exam for this chapter. And again, I think if you've gotten this far, you know that you were able to find those on Canvas. Okay, and I'll continue to do that as we head in. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our upcoming week and how we're going to get ready for our actual exam. But let's just go ahead and take a look at some questions related to these chapter 14 subjects. So factors that influence the level of fraud risk faced by an organization include which of the following: nature of the business, effectiveness of the controls, the ethics and values. Yeah, obviously, as we've said, all of these things are significant. Okay. This is sort of more of a fill in the blank disguising itself as a multiple choice question. I might give you something like this. Okay. But we know that preventative controls are designed to stop an undesirable event from occurring, whereas detective controls are designed to identify an undesirable event that has already occurred. Okay. And then we mentioned a little bit the corrective controls. And again, I'm just sort of mentioning that as a point of interest within artificial intelligence. Why not? If things see something that's not, meeting an expectation, then it can adjust to that and adapt to that and do what it needs to maybe prevent that from, correct that, and therefore prevent it from happening again and again and again before anybody identifies it. I hear folks talking about, just off subject a little bit, I hear folks talking about, well, artificial intelligence. Well, I'm not quite sure I'm getting it, because the artificial intelligence can adapt, but it can only adapt to what is already known. I don't think the artificial intelligence can come up with something that has never been thought of before and somehow adapt to it. So, this idea that it's going to, get out of control. I mean, it could get out of control if the wrong information is given to the machine to begin with, for it to then go ahead and adapt into an undesirable activity of some sort. Anyway, number 3, the objective of fraud risk assessment is to help management recognize factors that make an organization most vulnerable to fraud, so that management can address those factors to reduce the exposure. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. That's true. In general, management should avoid sharing the fraud risk assessment process. No, we had a multidisciplinary team, and we were going to eventually end up with some sort of reporting that would allow, everyone in the organization to realize their responsibilities and whatnot, right? Number 5, fraudulent financial reporting risk includes which of the following? Again, fraudulent financial reporting is affecting the financial reports, whereas these others would be good examples of what the misappropriation of assets, the stealing, the larceny, all synonymous terms. Number 6, effective internal controls can eliminate the need for the fraud risk assessment. No, because people change, organizations change, economy changes, business changes, the world changes. Sarbanes for public companies figure that out once a year, and I've given the idea here that you should at least, it may be at a high level, do some sort of analytical procedures like a vertical or horizontal analysis, that allows you on a quarterly basis to see if something's going. And then the more detailed stuff that we're talking about should probably happen, on an annual basis per Sarbanes, where you're going and looking to see that the control is designed, having the implementation, having the operating effectiveness, feeding that back in to the board of directors. That should happen at least annually. Okay. Which of the following factors should be considered when selecting a sponsor? Again, you don't want the brand new person coming. Guess what? You're going to come up with our fraud risk assessment. I don't even know how to fill out my time card yet, right? Seniority. So in other words, independence. Okay, probably the internal auditors probably need to be heavily involved in that. Ability to elicit cooperation. You could have a high-level sponsor, but if the individual is one that, for whatever reason, folks aren't going to be working with them effectively, you might want to give them some help by maybe having, sometimes you could have someone that's a liaison. So even though you have someone that has all the technical knowledge and whatnot, they can be helped almost, I don't want to use bad cop, good cop analogy here, but the feeling that there's an appeal process, right? So you have maybe the person that's leading it that has asked for this, but you put a management, senior management representative for the team, and it's another person over here, and they feel, well, I'm going to go to Frank if you keep asking me for this, and Frank, then because they felt that they were able to appeal to Frank, okay, well, Frank said, well, John is just trying to get the work done, and if you were to help, so you could set up a structure also that will help with that cooperation. So it's not all about, let's put the most handsome, pretty person up there, because that's going to make it easier, and you maybe have somebody there that there's an appeal process and create a structure. And I think I've said enough about that. Okay, number 8. Which of the following factors should be considered in assessing the likelihood of the occurrence of each fraud risk? Okay, and what the internal control environment is the one that sits at the top and touches all those other pieces. And I showed you that COSO cue. Management is not likely to have sufficient knowledge of controls to override them. Yes, they are. They're the ones that installed the buttons. They should know how to press them to make them stop working if they want to. So no, that's absolutely false. Number 10, which of the following is not one of the 3 interrelated elements that enable someone to commit fraud? What was it? Opportunity, incentive and pressure, which the book also calls non-shareable financial risk, rationalization, attitude, right? And so fraud risk is what? Fraud risk is the risk that the bad thing will happen, and it's being influenced by the other 3 choices in this particular question. The results of fraud risk assessment can help auditors design programs, procedures in a way, can help auditors, design programs, procedure in a way that enables the auditors to look for fraud in known areas. Oh, I see. Yeah, if you're an auditor, once you understand the design and whether it's been implemented, you make an assessment of the risk of material misstatement, and then you respond accordingly. Okay, and so they're putting it in the language of how auditors look at it, but management is doing the same thing. So that's why I paused on auditors. Management would do this too, and then design procedures that would help to detect those problems. So then again, they can make the corrections, etc. It's not important to consider reputation risk. Yes, it is. Reputation risk is always something a company needs to, and companies are learning the hard way that they need to consider that. 13, the vulnerability of an organization to those capable of overcoming the 3 elements of the fraud triangle is known as which of the following? That's the fraud risk. Okay, the chance that somebody will get over all of our efforts and commit the bad thing, that's the fraud risk. And again, we look for those fraud risk factors and how they're affecting and driving up that fraud risk so we can respond accordingly. Which of the following is a type of detective control? Surprise audits, these other things, segregation of duties, performing background checks, ensuring proper alignment between an individual authority and the level of responsibilities, or also that's kind of almost a subset of segregation of duties. Yeah, all of these would be preventative controls. Detective controls would be things that we do to detective, for example, surprise audit. Which of the following is not a true statement? It is more of a science than an art. Okay. I don't know that we should say, this question, it's more of a science, that's wrong. Because there may be science, but there certainly is there certainly is art involved in this. Again, going back to how I sort of drew those arrows going all over the place, you probably got that sense at some point, well, John, how come, how come we don't have rationalization just affecting, the controls? Well, it affected controls, but if you look at it, it could also be affecting the inherent risk. Okay, not just the control risk, the rationalization. Why isn't only opportunity hitting controls? Maybe that's a better way to put it. Well, but you could also have rationalization affecting the control risk. You could also have rationalization affecting the inherent risk. From the control risk side, management overrides the controls. From the inherent risk side, I'm going to make these transactions more complex because I'm the only one that understands this stuff and I don't want to be bothered by these procedures and whatnot. So let me put these complexities in place that will avoid me having to be accountable for whatever. Okay. Again, I think you're getting the sense of the art by the way I'm describing this. Okay. All right, good. So what I want to do quickly in the time we have left, okay, is just remind you that not this coming week, but the week after that, we will be having our exams. So we're coming up on May 8th. I'll be posting a lecture and slides and whatnot for our interviewing techniques. And then we will have the exam week the week after that. And remember, I am going to have the exam available for you that entire week. So it'll open on Monday the 15th, and I will leave it open for that entire week. And you need to pick a 3-hour window to work the 30 multiple choice questions. And I'll be putting up a practice midterm for that as well. So for chapter 15, and I'll be then showing you how to use that information from 4 chapters, 5 chapters here, to then prepare for your midterm, and we'll take it in campus online. And I'll talk more about that next week, but I just wanted to give you that quick heads up. Okay, guys, have a good week, and I will see you soon on the next lecture, okay?